Good evening. Hi, Haley. Thanks for saying hi. I can see your chat tonight. That's great. So that's working. Um, Wonderful. Awesome. Awesome. Okay. I'll just give everybody another minute to jump in if they're going to be joining us tonight. And of course, if you are joining for the first time, I am Carrie Scott, and I am the founder of the Soul Selves framework. And this is session 4 of the Soul Selves sessions that I've been doing one every month for the past few months. Tonight, I am going to be taking sort of a deeper dive into this idea of presence and time in relation to the soul selves. So there's past, the present moment, future, and then this idea of presence and how those are all interrelated and act as an indicator to help us determine which level of consciousness we're in and which soul self we're in, essentially. So, yeah. In the past few sessions, I always have been sharing an analogy to help us sort of understand what the soul selves may be or how to sort of interact with them. And I'm kind of realizing that I don't know if I've really truly explained what the soul selves give us in terms of value when we are learning about them and like implementing them in our lives. I understand it on sort of this visceral level because it like emerged out of my own experience, but I don't know if I've yet really figured out the words to describe how other people can use the soul selves to um, add value to their own spiritual awakening or their own personal development experience, their own personal growth. And I just kind of want to touch on that a little bit and say, for starters, that as I've been researching this and learning more about the spiritual journey and awakening experiences and talking to other people and reading books and so on and so forth, there have been other frameworks very similar to the Soul Selves framework that have emerged um, in all of these, the work that I've been doing. And um, I find it so fascinating because everybody's kind of got their own language, and the the place where they're beginning from isn't always the same. As they say, there's like many paths up the mountain, but they're all kind of converging at this similar place. And in my terminology or my experience, that place is always self-love. And I've found when I apply my soul selves framework to all of the aspects of my life, for instance, in the book that I wrote about it, I talk about it from the aspect of grief, of abundance, of eating or food and relationships. And when we move through each of the soul selves in any one of those aspects, the transcendent self is always emerging and showing up as transcendent self love. And so it always comes back to that idea of self love. And even in the book, I look at self love specifically through all of the 5 soul selves. And it's fascinating to see how self-love looks in the bodily self compared to in the thinking self, compared to in the observer self, and then how different again it feels in the transcendent self. So all of these practices that we have towards self-love really start to shift in perspective and gain a sort of a deeper understanding. And when we move to that point of transcendent self-love on any aspect of our journey, whether it's from grief or whether it's from relationships. Once we get to that sort of transcendent place, we realize that's sort of what we're shooting for in all aspects of our life. Hopefully that sort of makes sense. And so when you learn to navigate through any of these frameworks that are offered out there, that are presented, um, you you're basically, what I'm hoping anyways, and my intention is that, even if you're not adopting the Soul Selves framework per se, you're within yourself sort of creating a deeper understanding of what's happening along your own personal development journey, because there are these markers or these significant moments and these significant experiences, I think, that happen kind of universally, that can kind of root us in where we're at any given time, and help us to understand what might be coming next, or what we can do, to sort of turn our awareness inwards and move into the next perspective that is available to us, and so on and so forth, I should say. And I think, again, it's really important to remind, everybody, that wherever we are on this personal development journey is divine. It's all equally, um, rooted in that light of the soul, and there is no destination. There's definitely better feeling places along the spectrum, than others, but it doesn't mean that any place is any less valuable than any others, because we're all going to be moving all of these different, experiences at some point on our journey, and we're going to be going back to certain places on our journey too. And I think, in the discussion tonight, I'm going to be looking a little bit deeper at the observer self, and this idea of compassion really becomes part of, a sort of deeper perspective in the observer self. So with that being said, the analogy that I'd like to share tonight is that of the ocean. And I think this is a common analogy in, I guess, spiritual circles. And I apologize if I completely butcher it in terms of how it comes across. But it's a good one in terms of, looking again at each of the soul selves in relation to sort of this metaphorical ocean of our lives. So when we are in the bodily self, which is the first of the 5 soul selves that I have discovered and given names to along this journey, we are essentially like the waves on the surface of the ocean. So any disturbance in our life is another wave. And sometimes, we just have sort of these ripples on the ocean, and maybe even days where, we're calm and things are going great, and there really aren't any disturbances in our life. But as soon as that disturbance comes, there becomes a little wave, and sometimes those waves can just be enormous. It's like, a northwesterly blowing in here, and creating what is usually sort of a calm ocean into, waves big enough for surfing, right? And it's water crashing around us, up and down, all over the place. It's very, um, exhausting to try and be swimming in this ocean of waves, and everything is, just disturbed all the time. There's so much going on. Um, when we move into the vital self, it's kind of like one of those waves that's come and like crashed over us and submerged us into the water. And for, a brief moment, maybe a little bit longer, we're under the water and it's quieter and calmer, but we're still, being moved around by the currents. But there's a certain peace that emerges in the vital self, that now all of a sudden we realize, the waves are there, and under the water, it's mostly silent and calm. But what we don't yet realize in the vital self is that we can actually breathe underwater in the ocean. So we scramble back up, to the surface and get back into the waves and moving into the thinking self. We're gonna learn how to surf these waves. So we're gonna grab our surfboard and we're gonna learn about the currents and we're gonna learn about the winds and we're gonna learn about everything that's happening to cause these disturbances on the water and how we can master being on these waves. How are we going to navigate this ocean with these waves, and where is it going to take us? And so we're learning to surf, and we may crash a few times and end up back underwater again and learn something else, and then we're going to apply what we're learning to the next thing that we do, and maybe we'll get rid of our surfboard and get a sailboat, and we're just going to keep trying to navigate these waves as best we can until eventually another giant wave just comes and submerges us again. And then we are moving into the observer self. And so again, we find ourselves underwater and we're not going to fight it anymore. We're just relaxing back and we're sinking and sinking and sinking, and it's calm and it's quiet and there's no disturbances. We just can look up now at the surface of the ocean and surface of the water, and we can see all those waves up there, but they're not bothering us under here in the water. And here we are comfortably settling into the ocean floor, and we can breathe, and those disturbances, those waves, are not affecting us at all anymore. We're just simply here in the calm, in the quiet. And then when we move into the transcendent self, we realize that we are the ocean. We're one with the ocean. There is no independent being in the water looking at the waves. We just are the ocean. So over the past 3 months, this is the 4th month now, I guess, I have been looking at the Soul Selves framework in relation to indicators. So the first indicator was awareness. The second was the nervous system. The third last month was satisfaction, or this sort of cycle of fulfillment. And tonight is this idea of presence. So I'm just going to go back through each one of the soul selves with all of those indicators in mind, and then expand on it in terms of tonight's indicator. And again, these indicators are just there to help us bring our awareness to them. When we bring our awareness to these indicators, they help us understand which level of consciousness or which soul self we are in at any given moment. And when we have this awareness, we can then take steps to either shift our thinking or change our surroundings, or bring our awareness from the external, or maybe try a new modality. The options are kind of endless in terms of what we can do. But if we're sort of in a situation, and this one will come up again later in the observer self, but if we're in a situation where we are triggered by something externally, maybe it's a person or an event that happened, or some sort of emotion arises suddenly that causes us to get disturbed, like the waves on the ocean, we can then bring our awareness to what that disturbance is, or to how we are reacting to that disturbance, and then change our relationship with it. Instead of reacting as sort of a pattern of behavior that we might have, we are going to find out what that disturbance means to us in terms of what ego is playing out a role in this situation, and what can we do to embrace that ego. How can we learn about that part of ourselves in order to work with it as opposed to work against it. And this is something that I hear in many different people's terminology, but in terms of the soul selves, like when you move into that observer self, and you are triggered by something, you start to really embrace all of those opportunities to be triggered, and you start challenging yourself in ways that you might not normally challenge yourself, in order to push yourself out of your comfort zone, in order to learn more about yourself and how to move through that and past that. And it becomes this sort of path of personal growth that you really look forward to happening, which is kind of a twist, because before the observer self, when you're in the thinking self or the vital self, or especially in the bodily self, you're avoiding these things like nobody's business, right? You don't want to be triggered. You don't want to know more. It's really a vulnerable place to be. But when you get into that place where you're now welcoming that into your life in order to move more into your true self, and uncover that light of your soul that's shining underneath all these layers that are hiding it, it becomes a really powerful and empowering experience. So, bodily self. That's number one. We're beginning with the bodily self. And this is when we are most rooted in our ego. We have no self awareness, essentially. And we are stuck in this level, or this pattern of cycle of fulfillment. So we're looking externally for validation, we're looking externally for satisfaction, and we are hoping that, the next thing that we add to our identity, the next sort of layer of ego that we add, is going to bring us satisfaction. And what we don't realize yet is that that satisfaction is just temporary. So we just keep doing it and keep doing it, and adding more and more layers of identity in order to find some sort of fulfillment in our lives. But ultimately, all of that seeking and pressures, and trying to find this external validation can lead us to this suffering, the sense of suffering, and we end up in what I call the sympathetic overdrive, where our nervous system is now stuck into the sympathetic, and we're often in fight or flight. So the bodily self can be quite a tumultuous place to be in, and it it leads us to all sorts of sort of emotions, and potentially depressions and addictions and habits. And well, I mean, we can be happy in the bodily self too, don't get me wrong, but over time, just all of the pressures of life really sort of condense down in the bodily self to cause us a lot of pain and frustration. And one of the two things that really stand out for the bodily self is that we feel like a victim, and we're kind of stuck in that victim mentality, and we often blame others for the way that we are feeling and the things that are happening to us. And we have yet to understand that we need to, take responsibility for the things that are happening in our lives in order for things to change. So when we move into the vital self, this is now when we have that first glimpse of our soul. Maybe that ego cracked slightly, and this light of our soul has shone through. The significant part about the vital self is we've now shifted suddenly into our parasympathetic nervous system, if you remember our nostril breathing from a couple months ago. And our awareness is on awareness. Suddenly we know that we can have some sort of awareness on something that is greater than ourselves. It just, brings us into this place of profound bliss, if not just momentarily, maybe for a prolonged period of time. But we know now that there's something else beyond the way that we've been living, and we want to know more about it and we want to experience it. But what we think is happening in the vital self is that it is still something external that is that is giving us this profound sense of bliss. What we don't yet realize is that that actually is an internal functioning that's happening, and that we have access to that anytime. So these experiences in the vital self are bringing us right into the present moment. And I'm going to back up because I forgot to mention this. The whole point of tonight, in the bodily self, we are either regretting the past or worrying about the future. And that's what Matt Cannon says about the past and the future. Very typically, our thoughts and our words and conversations are going to be centered or focused on past events or future events. We're either going to be in one or the other. So the bodily self, one of the main indicators that tells us where we are at is this idea of time. If we're in the past or in the future, we're not present in the moment in the bodily self. That happens in the vital self. So when we get into the vital self, we have all of a sudden this sort of focus of attention, like the distractions of the bodily self have gone away, and all of a sudden our attention is drawn into a moment, like looking at a sunset. And we're so present with that sunset for just an instant or maybe just a couple moments, that everything else just fades away. And again, we move into that parasympathetic state, and the light of our soul is able to shine through. There's sort of this relaxing that happens, and focusing because of the absence of distractions. We are able to be so intensely present. And this, can happen when we're mountain climbing, when we're dancing, when we're doing art or listening to music. There's all sorts of examples, obviously, of when we have these profound moments of bliss that are really rooted again in the present moment. And we do realize at some point that, like, the present moment is all that we have, but we do spend so much of our time thinking about the past and worrying about the future that this whole idea of present sort of becomes a bit of a wash. When we get curious about this and move into the thinking self, this is again where our awareness now is on our mind and on our thoughts. We are fluctuating back and forth between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system, because we're starting to turn that awareness inwards. We're listening to the thoughts that we're having. We're bringing our attention to our emotions. We're naming them. This is where last month I introduced the 3 different categories of modalities in terms of energy awareness, energy movement, and energy clearing. And as we're learning more about the ego, as we're really doing that work, doing the shadow work, to get to know ourselves in a whole different way, we're becoming vulnerable and healing ourselves, healing our traumas, and so on. We are being triggered by things. We're going to be running in fight or flight from things, and then we're going to be celebrating in ease because of the knowledge that's surfacing. And so there is a lot of back and forth that happens. And similarly with this idea of time, we are going to be thinking about the past. We're going to be thinking about the future. But the real gift in thinking self is that all of a sudden we now have this awareness of the present moment, and we'll be able to, like, bring our attention to our thoughts and be like, okay, that I'm stuck in the past. This is keeping me stuck in the past. I need to find a practice to bring myself into the present moment right now. And so this gift of the present moment is us bringing our awareness to the fact that we're not in the present moment, and we can now use our discernment and take action in order to bring ourselves into the moment. So one of the practices that I learned on this journey so far to bring myself into the present moment, I first learned it from Elizabeth Gilbert, and I don't know if she is the originator of this practice, but I always associate it with her. And it's a simple practice where you name 5 things that you can see, 4 things that you can hear, 3 things that you can touch, 2 things that you can smell, and 1 thing that you can taste. So it's really focused on our senses, right? Our 5 sort of physical senses. So feel free to do this with me right now, and we'll just sort of bring ourselves into the present moment. So 5 things that I can see right now are, my fingers and the light shining on them. I've got this special sort of rug in front of me right now. I can obviously see my electronics, and I can see the clothing that I'm wearing, and my skin. So 4 things that I can hear right now are my voice speaking. I can hear the sound of the shells on my necklace as they bump against each other. I can hear myself breathing, and I can hear the rain and the wind outside. And then 3 things that I can feel or touch. I notice that my fingers are cold right now, and I can wiggle my toes. And then I'm feeling the warmth in the chair underneath my seat. And then 2 things that I can smell. I can smell my perfume that I put on earlier, or my body spray. And I can smell this mohair blanket that I'm sitting with. And then 1 thing that I can taste. And I had a little bit of, this is going to sound weird, a little bit of almond roca that I made earlier, and I can still sort of taste the almonds, I think, from that treat. So that is the present moment practice, and there's no end to the possibilities of present moment practices that we can implement into our daily routine to bring us back into focus. I mean, sometimes it's just a matter of just like reminding ourselves to take a deep breath and just recenter ourselves. And I would love to hear what practices you might have on your own to ground yourself and be present in the moment. And then we're going to move into the observer self. And this is, okay, again, going back to our analogy at the beginning, this is when now we're moving under the water, and the disturbances, the waves on the surface of the ocean we're witnessing them. We see them up there. So the real shift that happens in the observer self is, again, we're taking a step back from everything that's going on in the thinking self and the vital self and the bodily self. And we're simply becoming this sort of non-judgmental witness to our thoughts, to our emotions, to the sensations in our body, to the events that are happening externally to us. And so inner and outer, we are just witnessing, we're just watching. And there's a certain sense of calm and ease and detachment that happens when we're able to step back from that. And it's a really interesting shift in perspective, because all of a sudden, those thoughts that we're having, or those emotions that we're so aware of in the thinking self, we don't identify with them anymore. So there's this sort of removal of them belonging to us. It's like they're happening to us or to our being, but they're not us. And there's this practice that I learned in sat saying called neti neti, and I'm not sure that I'm going to remember exactly the meaning of this, but it's like, I am not this, I am not this. And so when you see that emotion or that thought rising, you remind yourself, I'm not that, I am not that. And so if we look at that present moment practice in terms of like, I see my, for the five things that I see my hands. And then you counter that with, I am not that. I'm not my hands. And I am not the clothing that I am wearing. And I am not the sound of my necklace. I hear it, but I am not that, right? And it becomes this practice of ironically, it sounds like separation, but it's actually quite the opposite, because we are becoming sort of one with everything. All of those things that we use to bring us into that present moment are things that keep us separate as an ego from consciousness. But when we move back into the observer self and into this presence, we just are aware, and we're aware of consciousness. In maybe it was I can't remember if it was the first or second session, I talked about the observer self in relation to looking at a 3D poster. If you remember those 3D posters where you're looking at it and it's just sort of this whole mishmash of colors and shapes, and somewhere in there there's supposed to be some sort of image, but you can stare at it from all different angles and spend so much time like looking at this, but you can't figure out what the image is until you are able to just shift your perspective just enough. And I always said, if I looked at the reflection on the glass in front of the poster and focused my attention on that, then something would happen within my perspective that shifted my awareness in order to allow this 3D image to all of a sudden emerge from this poster. And once you're in there, it's so amazing, because you can move from side to side and up and down, and you can still remain within this 3D image now that you're interacting with. And first time that it happens, it's so shocking and so profound, but then the next time it gets easier and easier to apply that to other posters as you're looking at them. And this is so much like the shift that happens in the observer self, because you are really stepping back again from identifying with things, and you're just able to recognize that the ego has played this certain role to get you to the place that you are, but none of that necessarily belongs to you anymore. There's no need for this. And there's two topics in the observer self that I'd like to sort of hone in on a little bit. And that's this idea of grace and then non-attachment. And one of the things that I really noticed in my research was that when people were in their observer self, this idea of grace was a word that they used more often and more of the time. And it kind of takes on different meanings depending on who you're talking to, but it's this idea of allowing yourself to be vulnerable enough to really see what's going on kind of below the surface, and honor that, you've been on this journey, and you've made mistakes, or mistakes in this sense is a good thing, because that is how we learn, right? There's nothing wrong with mistakes. They're actually very valuable. And we find this level of inner compassion for who we were in the bodily self, or whenever we find ourselves back in the bodily self, because we realize that that is this place of contrast where we're going to be experiencing things that we don't want, in order to know what we do want, and how to like be authentic. So if we're in the bodily self and we've been conditioned to believe a certain thought, and then we get through our journey to realize that that belief no longer serves the person that we're becoming, then we have grace for ourselves in order to just let go of that belief and change that belief, and just let that be, right? um Again, as I mentioned at the beginning, this idea of compassion that emerges in the observer self is as because as we're going on this journey personally, we can then apply that to other people, and we can see maybe someone is blaming you, blaming me for something that's going on in their life, and you're able to understand that they are just rooted in the bodily self in this moment, and that's a divine place for them to be. This is part of their journey. They have been conditioned by the same societal conditions, or different societal conditions, and parenting, and all of the factors that have created their ego. And uh, from that, you're able to give them grace. You're able to offer them compassion, because maybe they haven't pro- proceeded along this personal development journey in a way that they're able to recognize that for themselves, but you're able to offer that to them, with or without them knowing. It just becomes this place of compassion where everybody's experience is divine. In terms of non-attachment, um, when we look at it in the bodily self, or in the vital self, or in the thinking self, it often is a really frightening idea that, you know, particularly it's this kind of concept that we have to let go of the belongings that we have, or we have to let go of people in our lives, or thoughts that we hold, or beliefs that we have. We want to detach from these things. But because we are looking for that external validation, we're in that cycle of fulfillment in the bodily self, in the vital self, in the thinking self. The idea of letting go of those external attachments is really intimidating, because we are getting our satisfaction and our fulfillment, even if it is temporary, from those belongings. But as we move into the observer self, and our perspective again is shifting on this deeper level, then non-attachment now becomes a very different sensation, a very different understanding, because we have shifted now to a really deep inner sense of satisfaction. And this is really important to realize, that blissful experience that we had in the vital self, that profound bliss, we can now recognize it essentially when we're sitting at the bottom of the ocean looking up at the waves above us. There's this calm and ease and satisfaction that emerges, because we're not interacting with those disturbances. We're not up there fighting the waves. We're down here just observing them, and we're no longer influenced by them in that way. So this inner sense of satisfaction gets stronger and stronger, and we realize that it's always available within us to tap into. And so this now takes us into the transcendent self, because when we reach that transcendent self, we are no longer interacting with our ego. And I don't want to say, because this causes a lot of confusion, I don't want to say that the ego disappears. I think what's happened by the time we've gotten to this transcendent self is we've just merged our ego and our soul into one thing. They are just this beautiful soul light that essentially is who we are when we're born. Because when we emerge from our mother's womb, we have no ego, we have no identity. We are just this pure being of soul light that is um, unhindered by beliefs and thoughts and all of these things. And so we return to that, and it is a profoundly blissful state to be in. And this is this idea that bliss is our birthright, because this is how we emerged. This is who we are at the core of our beings, all of us, this central space of bliss. And I want to remind you that you are supposed to feel good. You're supposed to feel blissful. This is your birthright. And you are entitled to feel good at all times. And I know that I needed to hear that many times in my life in order to realize that that was a possibility. Because I think with all of the layers of ego and disturbances that we have in our lives, we forget that, and it's sort of taken away from us unintentionally. But I want to remind you that you are entitled to feel good and blissful at any time, and that you have access to that within yourself at any given time. And it's just a matter of being curious about it and implementing practices that bring you closer and closer to that feeling. And so this is where ultimately that transcendent self-love really surfaces. And when you begin to tap into that, when you begin to realize that is within you, it is like turning on a fountain of love that is just flowing from within you. And you can first fill yourself up on that love, on that level of love, and then you can overflow it into your life and see it reflected back to you and share it with others. And it just begins to get, I'm not going to say that it gets easier and easier to tap into, but once you know what that feels like and once you're there, then you know when you return to it, right? You know what it is when you return to it. And the ego does a tricky thing. And I feel like maybe one day I'll put together a whole session just on the tricky things that the ego does in order to protect us from what we don't need protecting from. And it comes up with all of these distractions and thoughts and issues and triggers and events outside of ourselves in order to keep us from going back there. Because I think on some level, the ego thinks what if we go into that place of self-love, that it is going to get lost. And the whole purpose of the ego is to be present and to be hidden. But just know that there's these funny things that happen, and the more you begin to recognize your ego, the more you'll be able to recognize when it's trying to keep you from this sort of blissful state that's always available to you inside at all times. So yeah, that is sort of the transcendent self in a nutshell. Again, it gets harder and harder to talk about, as I've said before, because it is, again, this place that is an experience. And when you try and use words to explain this experience, the the words that we're using are coming from our mind, which is trying to explain a state that is actually beyond our mind. So when we're, in that place of pure consciousness, we know when we're there, and then we can step out of it and try and communicate that on some level, but we're communicating it from a place of the mind as opposed to beyond the mind. So if you are interested in looking at self-love from, or I guess through all of the soul selves, I have one of the first presentations that I did in the when I started talking about the soul selves was with this group, Illuminated Leaders, and I talked specifically about what the soul selves look like in relation to self-love. There is a recording of that on the YouTube channel, or on this YouTube channel, that you can go back and listen to. But just to give you a brief idea, like self love in the bodily self is things like, you're having your morning cup of coffee and you're taking that time for yourself, or eating chocolate, something that sort of brings you a little bit of pleasure, having a bath, or going in the shower to relax, maybe getting your nails done or your hair done. All of those things are bodily self actions in um, self love actions in the bodily self. And then, you move into the vital self with self love. And I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but then there's when you move into the thinking self, now you're doing things like maybe meditation, or you're doing yoga, or you're doing therapy, or something like, there's all of the modalities now that are actually self-love modalities that help promote sort of your well-being and your personal development again. um, then self-love again in the observer self takes on a whole different um, look again, until you reach that transcendent self-love, which again is that really inner fountain of love that just emerges and flows. And it's hard to explain again, without really experiencing it, but it's just this pure sense of satisfaction and bliss that really emerges from, source energy within you, from pure consciousness, and just radiates outward. And it's a beautiful, absolutely beautiful space to be in. So that has been my most exciting understanding, my most exciting discovery on this journey of awakening. And that is the message that I truly feel so blessed to be able to share. And I hope to get better and better at explaining it. And I'm so grateful to everybody that has tuned in to listen to these introductory Soul Self series and or sessions, and everybody that has reached out to me and commented and given me feedback. I'm incredibly grateful and appreciative of those words and how they have impacted you. I have some more things up my sleeve, so to speak, some more things up my sleeve, sort of coming down the pipe, in terms of um, more writing and more, um, I don't know if speaking is the right word, but more ways of sharing this information in a way that I think hopefully will be exciting and interesting, and you won't necessarily just have to listen to me chat at my computer for hours and hours at a time. But I truly hope that this has been valuable. I know it's been valuable to me, and I'm again grateful if you're just tuning in, or this is your fourth time listening to the Soul Self sessions. Um, it's a really good opportunity for me to just practice, um, sharing this information. And it's funny because even before I jumped on tonight, I was so aware. And like, even though I've been researching this, I've been on this journey for years now, I've been speaking about it. And, I wrote an entire book on this subject matter. I still came into this tonight feeling kind of uncertain about how I was going to share certain information, because it is so easy to forget. And it really takes a certain sort of level of intention and presence to be able to sort of tap into that, to be able to share it. And so if I can forget after doing all those things, I don't hold anybody else to remembering it until you've lived it. And this is part of the beauty of creating your own framework, and potentially using some of the Soul Selves framework in your own understanding, because it is what helps you, figure out what's going on at any given time, and it helps you remember. And if there's one thing that I can help you remember today and maybe tomorrow, it's that you are entitled to feel good. You're so entitled to feel good. Bliss is your birthright, and that is always accessible within you. Okay? Thank you. So much love to you all. And reach out to me if you have any questions. And yeah, I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, and happy holidays. Thanks. Bye.